I'm okay. Sleep all night and I work all day. Bonner, how are you? Good to see you.
Great to be here.
Oh, I'm looking forward to this show very much. Alex, how are
Good
you?
evening or good afternoon. I'm good, Tom.
And Dorothea Dickerman and her dogs.
Jolly are.
And Phoebe. Now we're all here. So let's begin. Welcome to our live audience, which probably needs no introduction to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship or the Blue Boar Tavern, but also welcome to those of you who may be viewing this program on YouTube in about a month's time or so, and may have no idea who we are. So, for those viewers, a very quick background, which can be easily expanded on by going to our site, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, where you will see that we are dedicated to investigating the Shakespeare authorship question and disseminating the evidence that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, 1550 to 1604, is the true author of the poems and plays published under the pseudonym William Shakespeare. Why would we want to do that? I think for many of us, it started when we found out that Stratford-on-Avon's William Shakespeare, as he was baptized, has on the order of 70 primary source documents to his name. They are mundane records of business transactions, property and lawsuits and the like, but not one of them has anything of any kind to do with being an author. In fact, since the invention of the printing press, the man from Stratford is the only supposed author for whom all the evidence is posthumous and ambiguous. If the act of writing were a crime, there wouldn't be enough evidence to convict him. Academia shrugs this off as irrelevant, but we Oxfordians don't. We think it's bizarre. And when we look at the enormous numbers of parallels between the life of Oxford, who was an author, and the works of William Shakespeare, we can't help but follow the evidence to its logical conclusion. Of course, that's not to say that Shakespeare plays weren't revised after publication, or that there weren't unacknowledged co-contributors. Which brings me to our guest today, Bob Prechter, who came by the tavern some 8 months ago or so to talk about Greene, Nash, and Peele, and revisits the tavern today to talk more in depth about Robert Greene, the person generally credited with coming up with the famous phrase, an upstart crow. Okay, Bob, over to you.
It's great to be in a bar room full of friends and acquaintances in the Oxfordian movement. You know, since the topic is green, I think we should all be drinking margaritas tonight.
I like that.
All right, so I'm going to kick it off with a little exposition because I want to sort of set the stage so we have a context within which to talk about Robert Greene. He's not just a random name that Oxford pulled out of a hat. He's part of a continuum of voices who happen to be writing prose fiction. So we'll start in 1576. Now, a lot of people think that euphuism was invented by John Lilly, but as many scholars have pointed out, a fully euphuistic book came out a couple of years beforehand. It was called Petit Palace of Petty His Pleasure by George Petty, or Petit. And it's telling stories just the way that euphuism stories unfolded. It's a major source for Shakespeare in his plays. One of the sources for Petty's book is Bartholomew Clerk's 1572 translation, The Courtier. And as we know, Oxford wrote the preface for that. So there are a lot of connections to Oxford right off the bat. Petty's second book, which came out in 1581, was a translation of a book that was written in Italian, and which came out in 1574. Now, why might Oxford have had a copy of it? Well, the next year, he was probably strolling around the bookstalls in the cities of Italy that he was visiting, and I'm sure he picked it up and brought it home, and that's why the English got it to read a translation of it. Now, the dedicatee of that book is Lady Marjorie Norris. Well, the Norris family is connected to the Vere family by marriage in 1461. The sister of the 13th Earl married a Norris. So there's a family connection with this guy. Now, George Battie writes these two very ambitious pieces, and you never hear from him again. And if you go into the biographies, you find that nobody knows much about him, really. They think he might have been a soldier at one time and that sort of thing. Okay, in 1578, another writer appears from nowhere. People don't know anything about this guy either. His name is Henry Wotton, W-O-T-T-O-N. And he wrote a book called A Courtly Controversy of Cupid's Cautels. Well, cautel is a rather rare word. It means tricks, so Cupid's tricks, right? It so happens that Shakespeare uses that word 4 times, so he was familiar with this rather unusual word. Well, Henry Wotton's book is dedicated to an interesting person as well, Anne Dacre Clifford. And Anne Clifford's orphan nephews were under the care of Oxford's first cousin once removed. She was in the household, and he had obviously met her numerous times. And then Henry Wotton disappears, and you never hear a thing from him. Then in the same year, 1578, John Lilly's famous book comes out, Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit, followed a year and a half later by Euphues and His England. And as we also know, the Earl of Oxford was the dedicatee of that book. I think it's one of 5 times that Oxford dedicated a book to himself and put it in someone else's name. Also in 1580, a writer you almost never hear about, I didn't find out about him until very late in this whole process. His name is Austin Saker, S-A-K-E-R. And like a lot of these people, he wrote only one amazing book. Is called Narbonus, The Labyrinth of Liberty. And if that sounds familiar, it sounds a lot like Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit. It's the same kind of title construction. And in this case, the dedicatee is someone called Sir Thomas Knight. Well, who's he? Well, he had been knighted in 1579. Then out comes this book dedicated to him. And guess what happened a few months later in 1581? Thomas Perrott served in a tournament at Whitehall with a group of defenders led by the Earl of Oxford. So I think once he became a knight, Oxford said, oh, I'll dedicate a book to you, and why don't you join my team in the tournament? And then he disappears and never writes another book. And these are very ambitious books. I mean, they're intricate stories and really well-written classic, a lot like the Euphues books. Okay, so now we're getting to Robert Greene, because in 1580, Robert Greene debuts. And he comes out with Mammalia Part 1. 15 of the dedicatees of Oxford's books I've been able to trace to Oxford's friends and relatives. The additional ones I couldn't make a connection, but I bet someone could find one if they tried. And again, Robert Greene dedicated a book to the Earl of Oxford. And I think he did this several times in order to throw people off the path. I think he also liked writing dedications to himself because he got to write out his whole panoply of titles and everything. And of course, it's rather interesting. Greene is in his own path. He's picking up where John Lilly left off. Now, John Lilly wrote those 2 books, and he never wrote another prose book in his life. He wrote some plays, but Euphues didn't die because Greene writes about him twice. There's a book he wrote in 1587 called Euphues, His Censure to Philautus. That's his friend Philautus. And then Menaphon, which came out in 1589, has a subtitle, Camilla's Arlarum to Slumbering Euphues. So he's keeping Euphues alive. He also wrote the preface, Greene did, to Thomas Lodge's Euphues' Shadow. So Euphues is staying alive through Greene. And then there's an overlap there because at the end of Greene's career, he starts writing satirical pamphlets. He writes Quit for an Upstart Courtier. He starts to write these county-catching pamphlets. And then Thomas Nash overlaps him a little bit. He starts coming in writing criticism. And very few people know, but scholars have pointed out that Nash's first book is packed with euphuistic constructions. That one's called Anatomy of Absurdity. So again, he's playing off Anatomy of Wit. I think Thomas Nash also dedicated a book to the Earl of Oxford, but he didn't name him. He calls him Master Apis Lapis, Gentle Master William. Many people have written articles, oh, that's definitely Oxford, and it is. So Nash sort of takes over where Greene was going. In other words, he takes over the satirical stuff. So you've got a stylistic continuum here. Lilly copied Petty, Greene copied Lilly, Nash overlaps Greene, and of course Shakespeare, and you can read volumes and volumes on this, drew from all three of those people. They even sounded like them so much that people said that Shakespeare plagiarized all of these people. The last play that came out in Greene's name was James IV, and many people have just flat out said, well, this is a Shakespeare play, Shakespeare-type play. Obviously, Robert Greene taught Shakespeare how to write a play, which is kind of fun. It was just one of the Shakespeare plays that he wrote. And to wrap this up, I'll ask two questions, which I'm sure this panel could answer in a flash. Why did all this activity begin in 1576? Yeah, that's when Oxford got back from Italy. And we already know that that's when he started writing plays like a madman. I think he came back with at least two purposes in life. One of them is to start writing plays to entertain the court, and the other one was to start, he loved Italian novels. And some of the ones I just talked about, some of these writers were pulling from the Italian novellas. And he decided he would write, prose stories and put them under other people's names. Okay, and the second question, which I think is interesting, there's a gap in this production. So he writes in 1580, late 1580, Mammalia Part 1 in Robert Greene's name. And then, just for the record, and we won't have to dwell on this, I'm convinced that he also wrote Rich, His Farewell to the Military Profession, which came out in 1581. Barnaby Rich has something like 36 books to his name, and this is the only one that Oxford wrote virtually in its entirety, except for one of the prefacing letters. So that comes out in early 1581. So from early 1581, Robert Greene is silent. All these prose writers are silent. They don't show up again until July 7th, 1583, when Mammalia Part 2 is signed as having come out. So if these are independent writers, why would there be a gap? If it's Oxford, I think we also can answer that question, why there was a gap from early 1581 to late spring 1583. And of course, that's because Oxford was occupied. He was got thrown in the Tower for getting Anne Vavasor pregnant. And then he was under house arrest. And then he was persona non grata at the court. I think he was spending all of his time trying to get back in the court's good graces. He finally did on the 1st of June, 1583. And so what happens 5 weeks later on July 7th? Well, Mammalia Part 2, remember, Part 1 came out in 1980, and there was this big gap. And all of a sudden, Mammalia Part 2 comes out. So it's not only sort of a continuum in terms of these writers one after another coming onto the fore and then disappearing, but also it's a part of the continuum of Oxford's life, and a number of other voices fit into those strange events as well. But at least this sort of gives you a background of where we're starting when we talk about Mr. Greene.
Cool. Can I jump in just quickly, Bob? Thanks for that really interesting background. I just wanted to share with people, these are two little snippets from Robert Greene's Mammalia and also from John Lilly's Euphues and Anatomy of Wit. These are short little excerpts, but I think you can kind of see Oxford's, his kind of biography sneaking in the way that obviously it does through the Shakespeare plays. So this is the opening from Mammalia by Robert Greene. This Velasco, after the decease of his father, was a ward of the Duke of Zamora, who, seeing him endued with great wealth and large possessions, having the disposition of his marriage in his hands, married him to a kinswoman of his named Salandra, a gentlewoman neither endued with wit nor adorned with beauty. So obviously, Duke of Zamora could be, Lord Burleigh, and Salandra his kinswoman is Anne Cecil, I guess. And then this is right at the beginning of Euphues, and, you know, the titular character. I love this because this is kind of Edward de Vere describing himself, I guess. This young gallant of more wit than wealth, and yet of more wealth than wisdom, thought himself so apt to all things that he gave himself almost to nothing but the practicing of those things commonly which are indecent, to these sharp wits, fine phrases, smooth quips, merry taunts, jesting without meaning, and abusing mirth without measure. So I don't know, I think it's fun to kind of read Greene or Lilly and pick up other pieces of Oxford's personality throughout them.
Yeah, Alexander Waugh has written, in his opinion, Oxford brought in his family members into virtually all the Shakespeare plays in one way or another. And you find he's doing the same things in the stories he's writing.
It's also, I mean, Greene is so funny. I find Greene, I mean, when I read Greene, I am just bursting out laughing because the humor is, I don't know how anybody can miss it. And sometimes I think people who read it and don't realize how funny he is think he's serious. He's almost never serious. But Bob, one thing about that introduction of yours that I would just like to emphasize, because it's a new thought to me, is there are a lot of one-hit wonders.
Yeah. So when people say, oh, that's too many voices, like, look, each one
hit geniuses, which I think just goes to prove the Stratfordian point that ordinary geniuses capable of writing extraordinary things are born every day in England.
Yeah.
And look at the list, right? All these guys are capable of bursting, you know, like Athena, full-fledged and grown from the brain of Zeus, ready to fight with the spear and produce great material.
There were quite a few writers during that period, but I've decided there were very few geniuses. I think Christopher Marlowe probably falls into that category. Spencer on the poetic side. Beyond that, oh my gosh, just try slogging through some of the early poems of some of these people, George Turberville and Whetstone, and people like that. They're just awful.
Bob, could you elaborate a little bit on these, well, I guess the term is personae, perhaps. I take it some of these individuals were real persons.
Most
and others, at least as far as we know, don't appear to have been real persons. That is, the paucity of biographical information suggests that it might have been a made-up name. Is that correct? And I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah, when I started this, I thought Shakespeare was a made-up name, and then he found a guy to fit it. Robert Greene sounds like a made-up name, and I couldn't find any evidence that the man existed. There's no history for Robert Greene before or after Cambridge. There are no dining hall records. You can find dining hall records for Christopher Marlowe. They know exactly when he was sitting down to eat. Robert Greene never did that. So I think he was mostly just made up, but there are some possible people that might have served as a place where he borrowed the name. I think there was a court jester, a dwarf court jester named Robert Greene. You know, so it's kind of like Tattoo of Fantasy Island. Anybody thought that was funny? I don't know. But yeah, so most of them, and even Thomas Nash, who I think was completely invented, there was a butler at Pembroke Hall, Cambridge, named Thomas Nash, and Oxford would have known him, and he might have said, oh, that's a cool name for a guy, criticism and satire, you know, I'll borrow it. But in terms of people walking around London that could possibly pretend to be the writer, there weren't for those people. But the vast majority of Oxford's voices are real people. And I think that's why he's fooled people all these years. I think, well, John Lilly obviously was a real person. George Petit was a real person. Austin Saker, I figured out, well, he's real too. There's not much of a biography, but they existed. So I think he would go around and tapping these people and just using their names.
And I think in terms of the Thomas Nash thing, I think maybe it's not Gabriel Harvey, but somebody writes The Trimming of Thomas Nash in that whole pamphlet war. And I think that's alluding right to the fact that this was a barber at the school. So it's almost like, I don't know, it's like attributing like something to the school lunch lady or something. And then people are having a laugh about it. Yeah.
And the guy who wrote that, believe it or not, most of the Orthodox people is the barber who wrote it, and it's impossible because it's too learned. And I said, I have to figure out who it was. And so I dug and dug, and then I found out someone else was writing the exact same kind of satires, grousing at Thomas Nash, both before and after that particular book came out. And if you don't mind waiting a couple of months, it's going to be in the article in the Oxfordian, who that guy is.
Exciting.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you tonight, Bob, is I went down to the Folger for its grand opening in late June, and one of the books that, and this is 4 years and $80 million later, one of the books they had open in their exhibit on Shakespeare is, of course, Greene's Groatsworth of Witte. And they have it open to the page that has the famous quote on it that Tom was referring to. I just wanted to read what they have, the Folger, have underneath it as the explanation about why this book is key so that everybody can, digest it. It's very short. All the placards in this exhibit are incredibly short in very large type. Here it goes. Shakespeare makes a name for himself and Upstart Crow, 1592. Shakespeare became a poet and playwright after he moved to London from Stratford upon Avon. His success attracted the attention of rival writers such as Robert Greene, who called him an upstart crow and who, quote, supposing he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. In other words, Shakespeare was beginning to get noticed. And that is the Folger's position on this book. Mr. Prechter, would you comment, please?
Well, that's the standard line, obviously. But, I was looking at this and I said, well, obviously he can't be talking about Shakespeare because he is Shakespeare. And I did do a presentation of the Oxfordian group, the annual meeting in Ashland a number of years ago. And one of the things, I said, I'm going to have to show that Shakespeare is holding the pen here. And there's all this invective, and it doesn't sound, like Midsummer Night's Dream or anything. But I ended up finding virtually all of the really colorful phrases that Greene uses, black as hell and all that sort of stuff. It's right there in the Shakespeare canon. So, Shakespeare did write it. So who's he talking about? Well, I wasn't the one who came up with this, but at least 3 Oxfordians have made a very good case for Edward Allen. Turns out Edward Allen did exactly what Greene accuses him of, which is to have taken scripts and penned in his own iambic blank verse. And it's on the record that he did that. I think it annoyed Oxford no end, and he felt he's just messing up displays, and he was warning his fellow playwrights about this guy. At the same time, he was playing a role in terms of how angry he was. There's a long story to Groatsworth. It's definitely worth talking about, but no, Shakespeare wrote it, so he's not talking about Shakespeare. And, the guy who invented the name Shakespeare just invented another two-word couplet, shake scene. So shake scene is not Shakespeare.
Yeah, Oxford sometimes uses shake bag as somebody's surname, right? Like it's just one of his little verbal quirks. All right, I am seeing there's
in fact, in the Shakespeare canon, I think there are about 16 of those two-word names.
On something here, sort of a mystery to me. It's claimed that the man from Stratford was becoming famous in 1592 because of Greene's Groatsworth of Witte. And of course, the reference is to the play Henry VI, Part 3, Player's Hide line, Woman's Heart and Hide. What baffles me is that play wasn't published with the name Shakespeare on it until 1619. So how was he becoming famous in 1592 for a play that wouldn't have his name on it for 27 years? I mean, for me, that is the end of the conversation. Sort of throw that out there. Also, could jump in if I might. We've got a question here from Jens in Germany. According to Diana Price's book, Nash ticks 9 out of the 10 literary paper trail categories. Peel ticks 8 out of 10, and even Greene 6 out of 10. For all three of them, there's documented evidence they were paid as writers. Is that all made up to hide the vir personae? Was Jens' question. Getting to your point, and I think that's what you're saying, right, Bob?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I just did 12, might have been 13. Indications that Thomas Nash, the writer, existed. And in the paper that's going to come out in the next Oxfordian, I go through every single one of those and show why not only does it not hold up as evidence that the man existed, but in almost all those cases is actually a very strong argument that he did not. And it's because people haven't read these things carefully enough and thought in the two possible contexts the best way to interpret those. So I don't think we want to get off on a big Nash tangent if we're talking about Greene, but he's a fascinating guy, and he's the one with probably the most exciting apparent biography of all of them. I mean, Greene has no biography to speak of. Nash has a big one, but it's because he wrote about himself without ever giving any details. It's kind of amazing. He was arguing with Gabriel Harvey in the press, so Harvey had a lot to say. When Greene was dying, Harvey made up a whole bunch of stuff, and Nash came in and started to grouse at Harvey about it all. So it looked like he's a real guy. Well, he was a real guy. He was just the Earl of Oxford, not anybody named Thomas Nash. And, you know, some of these real people, like Lodge, for instance, Thomas Lodge was a real guy. He had a real life. He had parents. He had inheritances. He was in court all the time. Robert Greene never went to court for anything. Nash never went to court for anything. Despite Robert Greene being, quote unquote, ubiquitous around London, everybody that's testified about it said, I've never seen the man. And since we're on this topic, I had a couple of really interesting quotes to that aim. Here's Gabriel Harvey in 1592, quote, I was altogether unacquainted with the man and never once saluted him by name. So we know he saluted the Earl of Oxford plenty of times, but he never saluted anyone named Robert Greene by that name. So Harvey's, you know, if you read him carefully, you can see he's being clever. He wasn't an idiot. But regardless, even if you don't accept that part, Harvey says, I never met him. Now, how could this guy have been so famous and so popular for 13 years, nearly 13 years, and Harvey never met him? And then strange news, Nash, his closest buddy, okay, everybody tells you, oh, they were just tight. Nash says he knew Greene, quote, only for a carouse or two. And by the way, that was over 2 years ago. I haven't seen him since. So his most popular, he's pouring out pamphlets like crazy. And of course, Nash didn't want to say he knew Greene lately because he had people looking into Robert Greene, and he didn't want to poke around looking for Thomas Nash to find Robert Greene. So he said, no, I haven't seen the guy. And then, and this is kind of fun, Greene's News comes out in 1593. After Greene supposedly died, he somehow kept popping up. Right. And this is by B.R. I think those initials are supposed to be Barnaby Rich, but it doesn't matter. Greene's ghost writes the book. And he says, I am the spirit of Robert Greene, not unknown unto thee, or by my name. My writings have given notice of my name unto infinite numbers of people that never knew me by the view of my person. So even his spirit is coming out and saying, yeah, nobody's ever seen me. And there's a good reason for that.
I have something to add to it that I just loved. I think several of these are in your book, and the one, but I was using the Dictionary of National Biography to make a quick overview. Ben Jonson writes, of all things, this is Ben Jonson, and they say he hints that, quote, Greene is a writer from whom one could steal without fear of detection.
Yeah.
And there's so many disclaimers all throughout this whole biography of the D&B that just it's just not going to inspire confidence. They know everything. Whoever's writing it knows everything is nonsense. It's just not supported.
You could steal from all his voices, and he couldn't say anything.
Undetected. I love that.
So here's a fun one. Dorothea, you mentioned his sense of humor, that you like reading Greene because he's funny.
Oh, it makes me laugh, yeah.
All right, so here's a disputation between a he and a she, conny catcher, con people. And inside is Nan the prostitute is quoted as follows, because she's annoyed at this Robert Greene. This is a couple of con men grousing about Robert Greene, exposing their tricks. And she says, I began to inquire what this RG should be. At last I learned that he was a conny catcher in his kind, though not at cards. So he's a con man. He's fooling everybody.
That actually, isn't it also an origin for that word is somebody who catches rabbits, right? Catching connies, catching rabbits. So yeah. No?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I always thought, I remember actually at the Folger hearing a long lecture on Thomas Nash and that conny catching book. And the explanation was, guys who go out and by dark of night and steal rabbits that belong to other people and put them in bags and walk off with them.
When I would mention the term conny catcher in like some of my TikTok videos, some of the Zoomers were like, thought it was something really off color.
Oh, right. Oh, that would go back to Chaucer, wouldn't it?
Always fun. So, Bob, how much fun is Oxford having being all these people?
I think he's having a good time. I think he posed as some of his voices. I think he posed as George Peele. He signed a receipt when he Gager's play Dido at Oxford University. He was playing Nash when he went to visit the Archbishop in late 1592 at Croydon. He hung out there. There's one guy who reported running into, Whitgift's Nash gentleman, he called him. And I think he was playing the role of Robert Greene when he went around, probably put on his, poor poet outfit, and he went to give Earl of Leicester his Planetomachia, and according to the household records, collected a few pounds for his trouble. So yeah, I think he loved playing roles, and I'm one of these people that I'm quite convinced that he probably trod the boards.
Oh, I agree with you, actually. I absolutely think he appeared in many of his own plays and probably other people's as well. Do you think that famous quote where Mary Sidney Herbert is all excited and she says, and the man Shakespeare may be there or is going to be there, talking about a party that she's giving? Do you think that's just a reference to Oxford, or do you think he actually what's coming as himself, so to speak, as his voice of Shakespeare? Who knows, right?
We can only guess, and I leave those things out of my book because I try to make sure every sentence, whether my conclusion is right or not, is a whole other question, but every sentence is a fact. So I don't know. My guess is for a visit. She's that name, but I don't know.
I think it's hard to confirm this, but I do think that there is a long tradition of Joni Mitchell used to dress up as a black guy and go to parties undercover and dress in drag. And I'm thinking about, the kind of Robin Williams kind of manic theatrical persona showing up as Mrs. Doubtfire and stuff. And, Edward de Vere is somebody extremely creative in a very stuffy, repressive atmosphere. It makes sense to me that he would enjoy, dressing up a little bit and playing different characters to get to escape. We know that he writes under pseudonym. So,
yeah.
And the commonality again of, for example, in, hip hop or something, everybody has a pseudonym, everybody has these personae, and it would be weird to show up and be your Christian name on stage.
By the way, there's one likeness of Robert Greene. It's a cartoon of him. And the DNB called it doubtless fanciful. But I actually took a little bit of time with that. And I think there are more elements to that cartoon pointing to the Earl of Oxford than people realize. If you're interested, we could take about a minute and a half and look at some pictures.
Let's do it.
Yay.
Okay. All right. So this is the cartoon of Robert Greene. It appears in a book in 1598. Somebody named John Dickinson decided that he would try his hand at imitating Robert Greene's style. So his name of his book was Greene and Conceit, and it's prose stories, kind of like the ones that Robert Greene wrote. And inside the book is this woodcut. All right, well, there's some interesting things, I think, about it. Notice that he's got a mustache, and it's curved a certain way. He's got a spiked beard, no hair on his cheeks, and he's got rounded eyebrows. Those are kind of interesting things. We're going to look at a couple other items let me scroll down here if I can.
He's also writing from right to left.
Okay.
He's not writing as one would ordinarily write English.
It could be. So anyway, that could be a problem. I don't know.
Could be Hebrew.
Here's a portrait of Oxford, right? And you can see the mustache, you can see the pointed beard, and you see those big rounded eyebrows. And that's kind of what we have here when you see them together. I think this was a model for the Greene face. But, as they say, there's more. Here it is next to the Ashburn portrait of Oxford. Now, the Ashburn was dated recently to 1597. And the drawing came out in 1598. And I'm going to draw your attention to a couple things where you see those red circles. We're going to look at Robert Greene's hands and also at the book that's sitting on the table. Okay, so look at the hands in the Ashburn portrait. He's got those long, slender figures, and you see those in all the portraits. But when you put them together, I think the guy who wrote this, who created this little cartoon, had seen the Ashburn portrait. And he took, if you look at the right hand in the cartoon, it's not really holding the pen quite properly. Most people write with their wrist, down on the paper. It's kind of up in the air. And that's the way the hands look in the Ashburn portrait. Now, what about the book? I think this guy might have seen Oxford's Geneva Bible somewhere. His book has the clasps on the side. They've got sort of a pointed end to them, just like on the Bible. It's got the 4 squares in each of the corners of the book in the Robert Greene picture. And Oxford's Geneva Bible had the 4 squares. The only thing he seems to have misremembered a little bit was that thing in the center, but there is an item in the center, and it was an oval, but he seems to have remembered it as a diamond. So I think he was leaving a few hints here that Oxford was the model for his Robert Greene cartoon.
And then, I mean, obviously, Bob, if you want to speak to more of why he's wearing a death shroud and writing.
Well, he was dead by then, but I don't know. Do you have a thought?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think it's a joke is that this is a character that Edward de Vere has to kill off because he gets threatened with exposure in a lawsuit for libeling Gabriel Harvey, I think. And so basically he has to immediately kill off Robert Greene in a series of pamphlets in which he's having these anguished deathbed regrets. And he's, that's when he ate too much Rhenish wine and pickled herring or whatever. And so he's dead and his friends are mourning him. But also he's writing these pamphlets. One of them is like a moment before death. One of them is during death. And the other one is, I just died, but I'm still writing anyway. And so I think the idea that he's wearing his coffin, his death shroud as he's writing is a wink to the idea that he was dead. But even his ghost is still writing these pamphlets, yelling at, Gabriel Harvey.
I like that very much. Yeah. He says repentance and he says, I'm dying, and that's it. And then out comes another book, and Oxford pulled it off the shelf. It's actually a bunch of stories that had nothing to do with who Greene had supposedly become by then. So he writes this introduction, which actually has a couple of contradictions in it. Yeah, I'm repenting, but I still can write, and this is at the instant of my death. So yeah, he's writing with the shroud, and then and then those other books came out. Anyway, I'm trying to think of the other book that he did. Oh, 4 Letters was Harvey's Grouse. It came out on December 4th, 1592. And on the 8th, 4 days later, suddenly Henry Chettle registered Kind Heart's Dream. And the ghost of Robert Greene appears again. And he says, yes, the spirit of Robert Greene visited me and laid a letter on my table, and it's a letter to Thomas Nash, and it says, Nash, please defend my memory against Harvey. And he's putting it in this book. So now, Oxford's got an excuse to turn Nash loose and start bashing Harvey. So yeah, he was, there's a song, a punk song called Not Dead Yet, and Robert Greene wasn't dead yet.
Not dead yet. And how do you, as a Stratfordian or somebody who reads Robert Greene as a real person, how do you explain that? I mean, this was for me. I mean, it's those books written after death, that just you've got to realize this is a complete and utter farce. And the writer is having a very good time with it. And join the joke, get on the train and appreciate that, Shakespeare did not spring any more fully formed out of nowhere. This is where he was and who he was, and he wasn't getting noticed by Greene. He was Greene.
Yeah. And now think about some of the things Harvey said when with total glee, realizing that Oxford was killing off this voice and that he was responsible. Harvey's now, for the first time, the man on top, and he's feeling his oats. And when he's describing the death of Robert Greene, he says, Greene had pawned all his property. So, right? So that's a dig at the Earl of Oxford. At Greene's side were his mistress, who is a prostitute, and their illegitimate son. So that's a little dig at Anne Vavasor and Henry Vere. He charges Greene with forsaking his own wife. And of course, Oxford had done that as well. And at the end, he says, Greene was buried in a churchyard near Bedlam, which was the hospital for the insane. In other words, they buried him next to the local nut house. But it could be pertinent that Oxford's headquarters throughout most of the 1580s was Fisher's Folly, which was across the street from Bedlam. So Harvey was really giving it to him with both fists. Now, here's what I like, and it's really interesting. If you read Nash and you pick out a line here and there, you go, oh, okay. So Nash writes, all right, Harvey, okay. So Greene died of, what did you say? Pickled herring and Rhenish wine. Okay, fine. If thou wilt needs have it so. In other words, if that's the way you want it, okay. And then he goes on, to continue to write. So it was clearly made up. And he was replying, yeah, it was made up. And if that's the way you want it, okay. It's literary. It wasn't history.
So if Greene is such a disreputable character, as everybody says, why is he a reliable witness for the existence of William Shakespeare in London in 1592? Would you believe anything that Robert Greene ever wrote?
Well, actually, I think Greene, was being honest when he was grousing in Groatsworth. I mean, I think Alan annoyed him, and he said so. But you can't understand that unless you get the context right. And then, yeah, there are other things when he made up his own death, for example. Now, here's something interesting. He planned the whole thing of Greene's change of heart and his death, because in 1590, in the book called Greene's Mourning Garment, Mourning, Garment, he's writing to the Earl of Cumberland, okay? And he says, I hope your lordship will be glad with Augustus Caesar to read the reformation of a second Ovid. Now, Ovid, as we all know, is Shakespeare's favorite source. And of course, Greene drew from Ovid as well. But what he was doing, Robert Greene had been writing love pamphlets. Well, what Ovid had done was he wrote love pamphlets, and then he wrote pamphlets about the pitfalls of love. And finally, he started writing these repentances to Caesar, saying, please let me come back to Rome. I hate it out here in the hinterlands. So in 1590, Oxford says, look, I'm going to do the same thing, and you're going to enjoy reading about it. And he immediately Greene starts to switch to the follies of love and the dangers of love, getting caught up with courtesans and stuff. And then he finally has his repentance and he's moaning and groaning and speaking in Calvinist terms. He's taken him right down the path he said he would do and brings him up to Ovid, and then has him die on his deathbed, forsaken man, kind of like Ovid was. So we know that was his favorite poet. And so then he turned his voice into kind of an Ovid, and he said so at the beginning, and he pulled it off.
Bob, does Robert Greene ever talk about Italy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Several things point to the Earl of Oxford in things that Greene wrote. For example, he claimed to have degrees from both universities. Oxford had degrees from both universities. He got his BA from St. John's. That happened to be Oxford's college at Cambridge. And by the way, Thomas Nash, the records for him are at St. John's as well. I think it's very handy. But you asked about Italy. Okay, so Robert Greene set Mammalia in Padua. That's where Tammy the Shrew is set. He set Farewell to Folly in a villa right outside Florence. And of course, All's Well takes place partly in Florence. And there's a book called Never Too Late. And one of the scholars said, oh, this book shows that Greene knew Italian customs. Well, Greene never went to Italy. In fact, Alexander Grossart was convinced that he had been to Italy because of this knowledge of Italy that he was claiming. So he went to Padua and poured through all the records at the university to see if he could find any trace of Robert Greene. And he came back, dragging his tail behind him, saying, no, there was not a trace of Robert Greene there. And of course there wasn't, because Greene never went there and Greene didn't even exist. And then in a notable discovery of cozenage, another one of those cunning catching books, 1591, Greene makes a sweeping claim. I'm going to read this because I have it up here. A sweeping claim to know by observation the customs of Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Poland, and Denmark. And we can trace Oxford's trips one way or another to all of those places. So yeah, every now and then he would kind of say things that outed him.
There was one question. There's so many questions. I will say this to people who have so many questions or enthused. I would encourage them to buy and go Oxford's Voices, because there's so much richness on the subject of Robert Greene, as well as so many others. But there was one question that I thought was consistent with all the voices. Is there a composite profile which can be drawn from their compiled narratives to suppose their collective philosophy, theological or otherwise? So does Robert Greene, you spoke a little bit about kind of the Ovid character arc, but do we see Robert Greene being monarchist or pro-Elizabeth, or kind of in this sort of Oxfordian vein of opinions about things?
That's an awesome question. And you have to be really careful about this. It took me years to sort of figure out, what was Oxford and what was just posing. And one thing that remains consistent throughout the entire canon is his absolute belief that the king or the queen was sovereign, period. Didn't matter if they were the rottenest people on earth. You owed your allegiance to them and you had to do whatever they wanted. And that was the proper order of things. When Marlowe came out with Tamburlaine parts 1 and 2 and had a hero who said, screw that, I don't care about fate, fortune, or kings, I'm going to make my own way through life, I'm ambitious. That was against everything Oxford believed. So he actually had Robert Greene write a couple of plays that had a very similar setup with a completely different moral. So he was very strong on that. I think he was very consistent for the most part. And I'm going to show you an example where he wasn't. On his religious points of view, he hated Puritans. All of his voices disliked the Puritans. And he also felt that there was almost nothing more important than writing style. Robert Greene wrote a short pamphlet. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was grousing about someone who had made a sermon. I think it was a Catholic priest or something. And he didn't go after him for the beliefs that expressed. He went after him because he didn't know how to compose a good sermon. He's lecturing on, you're a lousy writer. Okay, but I want to talk about a parallel between three voices, and you'll see what I mean about you can't always kind of trust what he says. to mean that this is his point of view. Robert Greene, as we said, he goes through life and suddenly at the end, he has this big religious conversion. And he writes this massive Calvinistic pamphlet, and it's just anguish and, hand-wringing like crazy. And then he dies. Well, 2 years later, Thomas Nash does the same thing. He's going along, he's writing all this satire, and suddenly he writes Christ's Tears over Jerusalem. And it's another big Calvinistic, it's almost crazy, the rant he's going on. And then he kind of wakes up and then he starts writing other stuff that has nothing to do with it. He just throws them in. So you can't certainly say, well, the Earl of Oxford, was a Calvinist. He wasn't, but he was showing people how to do it. And then Thomas Lodge, 2 years after that, 1596, he's coming out with the same type of book. What was it? Tears of Mary, Mother, I think was the name of his, which is just like Christ's Tears, but now it's by a different voice. And so every 2 years he had one of his voices go through this giant religious change, and all in the same manner, very passionate. Tears are flowing everywhere, and misery is abounding. And then, Lodge goes on to do some other things after that. So you can't really draw from the works and say he's always expressing his point of view. He was posing all the time, and he was he was doing literature. That was his number one thing. And I think he was saying, oh, you want to know how to write a sermon? I'll show you how to write a sermon. And then he would have one of his voices write one of these, off the charts, passionate sermons. And it was his way of saying, I can do anything better than you can.
Well, it reminds me of his quote, could write a better Bible in 6 days warning, which he's, quoted by, I guess, the Arundel libels, I think.
I think that even extended when he wrote that little porno verse under Nash's name. So I've read this stuff. It's no good. Let me show you how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So Bob, it's not a case of using, individual, one voice for poetry, one voice for novellas, one voice for, let me show you how to do it right. So Thomas Lodge, writes this under the name Thomas Lodge, this beautiful, beautiful novella, Rosalind Euphues's Golden Legacy, where half the story is based on Chaucer, which is based on an older poem, basically bemoaning the situation where younger brothers are left with nothing, older brothers take everything. Even in Tale of Gimmelin, which is the 13th or 14th century version of it, it's kind of a bro fest. The guy has to overcome all of these various obstacles in order to win from his older brother a fair share of what their father left him, and goes off into the forest. And, you sort of see As You Like It coming out of this, and yet nowhere does Rosalind appear, except for, of course, in Thomas Lodge's Rosalind Euphues's Golden Legacy. Where's that from? Why is Thomas Lodge the voice that comes up with this incredible woman who probably is a favorite heroine of almost anyone who reads Shakespeare's romantic comedies?
Right. And then in Romeo and Juliet, they say, what, you've forgotten Rosalind already?
Yeah, great line. Yeah, great line. Yeah.
So they're just, they're connected so completely. And Lodge is he did a sonnet sequence, and he did some rants, kind of like Nashian rants, although they usually had a religious tinge to them. And then he wrote, my personal favorite of all the prose stories is Rosalind. And as you just pointed out, the subtitle is Euphues's Golden Legacy. So that's the second of Thomas Lodge's books that mention Euphues and keeps that going. Usually I can figure out, kind of why he chose a particular voice, but Thomas Lodge is another grab bag guy. Now, this has got to tell you something, because, most people of the day, when they were trying to do something, weren't writing everything. They were either a poet, or maybe they were a playwright. Maybe they wrote a couple of prose books or whatever. But these voices are all doing it all. Yeah. And that was true of Lodge. And he wrote Marguerite, which is another one that's got some interesting things in it. And he was supposed to have written both of those books, by the way, while he was on the watery main and surge is coming over the bow and he's sitting there writing Rosaline. It's like, that's ridiculous. So I had to go through the Lodge biography and figure out what's real and what's fake. Well, Thomas Lodge never wrote anything, although I think he might have contributed to that play that they supposedly co-wrote. But he was on ship. In fact, the voyage that the biographers tell you that Lodge definitely was on, he definitely was not on. First of all, there are records of him being in London at the time. And secondly, almost nobody returned alive from that thing. I think they landed somewhere in Scotland. By the time 6 people made it back, and they would have known, and he would have written about it had he been through something so horrible, but it never happened. It's just Oxford's pretending to be Robert Greene and saying, oh yes, Lodge is away on another voyage and he's such an adventurer, and here's one of his stories. He is a creator. He created personas, and Lodge, we don't have time to talk about it, but was one of the most miserable human beings ever to walk the earth. He was an alcoholic. He constantly sued his own family members. He blew through money. He made the Earl of Oxford look like a miser the way he blew through money. He inherited the equivalent of $400,000 and blew it all in 3 years, and plus went in $100,000 in debt in the same period of time. So he was really a piece of work. So when does Lodge decide, I got to pack it up and do something else for a living? 1596. That's when Oxford retired to Hackney. He left his buddies in London behind. Lodge gets on a ship, goes to Paris, gets a medical degree, and comes back as a doctor because he wasn't being supported anymore. A lot of stories in the Naked City.
Our English Terence, indeed.
We are approaching that magic hour, unfortunately. Fascinating, Bob. Plug for you, of course, Oxford's Voices, everybody, buy that. And then in the Upstart, correct? You have an article coming out?
Yeah, in the Oxfordian, there's one on Nash.
All right, good.
Who by the way, is almost, he is universally considered to be a real person. So it's a very careful thing. I don't know if I'll convince anybody, but read it and see what you think. The only other person who came to that conclusion that I know of was Nina Green.
Yeah, definitely everyone should buy Oxford's Voices. And also, Bob and I recently had a conversation. I have a YouTube channel, Phoebe DeVere, with an underscore in between Phoebe and DeVere on YouTube. And so right now we have 2 parts out. The first part is me and Bob talking about summarizing some of the greatest juvenilia voices from Oxford. And then the second part is Oxford's work as a propagandist for Elizabeth's regime. So there's going to be a third part coming out about whether or not maybe some of the voices give a hint that he had a relationship with Queen Elizabeth that went beyond the professional. So yeah, check out Bob on the Phoebe DeVere channel. And people should really, if you got questions, you'll have them answered if you read Oxford's Voices.
And also, Phoebe, you remind me that if anyone goes to any of our social media sites, please click on like or vote, whatever it would happen to be. It really does help us if you do that. Much appreciated, everybody. Thank you so much, Bob. It was a pleasure. I learned so much.
Tom, thanks so much. Later. Yeah, it was a big opportunity for me because when I get to go back and look at this stuff again, I kind of relive the fun of it, and I appreciate that.
That came through. Definitely came through. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Drive safely.
Bye.